that if you still believe in white supremacy or any hints of white supremacy and are not at the absolute top of the social structure, you ought to go looking for somebody to be mad at, right? Because the benefits of being a white person are like shrinking and shrinking and shrinking to be an ordinary white person, a regular white person, not a wealthy, rich white person. And so the payoff for white supremacy, the clientele for that payoff is getting smaller and smaller and smaller. And in a sense, the majority of the white American population is dropping down to where black people are, which is to say your unemployment rate, your living conditions, your level of debt, your level of social anxiety is coming down to where we are. And I would like to say welcome to the club, or misery loves company, but I would prefer to think that once you comprehend that, there'll be a possibility of more joint action to correct that situation. And it raises, it's not just something that affects us, as black people, it affects you. And the failure of this nation to deal with that in the past has consequences for you. And I'll briefly give you a sweeping overview of how this came about, and then I'll narrow down on how, in fact, this impacts on you today. Virtually every discussion of American history, every part of the national narrative that you've been taught immediately gets qualified or disqualified once you bring in the reality of the African American experience. That's why there was always such a widespread resistance to the teaching of the African American experience. Every national mythology, every slogan, right? Every, song you sing, land of the free, home of the brave, when you say, what about black people, you have to start qualifying. In some cases, you have to throw it totally out. This is a democracy. What about slavery? We all created equal. What about Jim Crow? We can rise as far as you can based on your individual merits. What about discrimination, disenfranchisement, quotas? Every single thing, every single part of the national mythology has to be called into question when you bring in the African American experience. And this is not something new. This is at the beginning, the foundations of the country. The mythology of Puritans landing at Plymouth Rock, colonists seeking religious freedom in Virginia. They're trekking slaves with them all the way. The first commonwealth to make slavery legal was Massachusetts, not Georgia, not Virginia, not South Carolina, Massachusetts, right? There were slaves in every one of the 13 original colonies, So a narrative of a search for freedom and liberty is immediately qualified, but what about these slaves you have around you? The state that had the largest number of slaves.
Hello guys, welcome back to the channel. This is your presenter Jintoki Stories, and I'm hoping that you're super great from wherever you're watching us from. Now in today's video, there's something spectacular that I want us to talk about. Now for the longest time, you've known that white people have grown having an illusion of white supremacy, right? And when you take it back to the periods of Back on Rebellion, you get to realize that the elites created an illusion to white people, and they structurally made it possible for them to think and feel that they were greater than black folks. Now, in the contemporary United States, look at everything which is happening. White folks are complaining about the living standards. White folks are complaining about all other problems that black people have been going through. What does this show you? This shows you that the white supremacy is failing because the elites who created this illusion are now tired, or they're maximizing ways of making money. So as a result, they don't care if you're a white person because they lie to you that you're great. Now, this is what Dr. John H. Bracey tries to talk about. John H. Bracey is a prominent historian and a scholar in African American studies. He often emphasizes how ideology of white supremacy was designed to maintain the dominance of white elites, which has actually functioned to the detriment of working class poor white people. Now, white supremacy operates by creating an illusion of privilege for all whites, when in reality, economic and social benefits are disproportionately ordered by small elite. This false sense of superiority distracts many white people from recognizing their shared class interest with people of color. Instead of organizing collectivity across, you know, interest within the people of color, instead of organizing collectively across racial lines to challenge the economic inequality, white workers have historically been co-opted into defending a system that exploits them. Thus, racism fractures potential labor solidarity and leaves white workers vulnerable to their very economic structures they believe they're protected by. So that's what has always happened. There was an illusion that was sold to white people by the elites. And remember that usually the elites usually do this if it only makes them profit, right? And so they didn't make enough, and so they had to come for you, the white person. And that explains why today you're seeing a lot of people, a lot of white folks complaining about the same very things that 200 years ago black people are complaining about. 200 years ago black people are complaining about. Now you gotta see them try to complain about the same things. So these are presented GTech stories. I want to switch this video and then I'll be back. I'll be sharing my thoughts in regards to this. And also for those who are watching us for the first time, I'll ask you to subscribe to the channel, join our membership, really get to see what we can offer you. For those who are sending me super thanks, for those who are supporting me through my Cash App, I really, really appreciate the service that you're doing to me. It really goes a long way. I appreciate everything that you all trying to do out there. Now, let's watch the video. I'll be back and I'll share my thoughts in regards to this.
Outside of the South, outside of Georgia, second most largest, New York. New York. You know, this is not a down there phenomenon. You say, well, I'm from north, slavery was down there somewhere. No, slavery was here. And a mythology, that tries to make racism something somewhere else, robs you of your understanding of your relationship to that history. Disarms you in your ability to function in the world, with the antagonism that you see before you. And it's just part of the cost, right? The political cost after the American Revolution. The majority of slaves in the American Revolution fought for the British. Why? Because a monarchy promised to give abolition to those that fought. The patriots, fighters for liberty, did not. Right? So if I'm a slave and have a choice of who I'm going to run away and fight for, I'm fighting with Lord Dunsmore in South Carolina. I'm fighting with the British, right? Not with George Washington, a slaveholder, or Thomas Jefferson, a slaveholder, or Patrick Henry, a slaveholder. Give me liberty or give me death. What about me? Great slogan, right? The failure to extend that ideology, right, throughout this society calls that ideology into question. Yeah. It's beginning cost to racism is hypocrisy. You have a democratic Republican constitution. Well, first of all, democracy can't be democracy if half of the population, females, are put in a box and sent over there somewhere. Like, we're not even talking about them yet. Let's not even talk democracy, talking about human beings. Democracy means like men, and white men with property, So just the notion of democracy, it's like a narrow, finite notion at the beginning. And this is built into the Constitution, right? When the country is set up. And to handle this problem, we set up one of the great quarter systems of all time, which is to say the House and the Senate. People talk about they don't believe in quotas and affirmative action is quotas. The U.S. Senate is a quota system. Every state gets 2 senators, regardless of population. Is that fair? Rhode Island and Texas are equal. North Dakota, California are equal. 400,000 white people in North Dakota have the same number of senators as 20 million people that live in California. It's a quota system. People don't object to that one. I haven't heard a word about that one. Right? So a fundamental inequality was built into the Constitution at the beginning. Why? To handle the problem of what? Slaves. Right? We were here as property. We were brought here as property. Right? But when it came time to count people in terms of representation in the House, we became people all of a sudden. The same people that owned us and kept us on a list with horses and cows, barrels of molasses, discovered when it came time to get political representation, we were people and should be counted for purposes of representation. Right? Well, since the founding fathers were wise men, we got the discount, 3/5. We weren't whole people. We're 60%, 40% off. Right? So in fact, built into the Constitution is everybody's people except black people who get 40% off. Right? How do you walk around the world and talk about democracy when the Constitution says that? The Constitution says that. It's not an add-on. It's the original. Right? What does this ensure? Right? Non-democratic representation in the national government of slaveholders. First presidents, Supreme Court justices, right? A national policy, right, that pursues slavery as a policy while talking freedom. Right? All of the major wars in this country down to the Civil War are fought to extend slavery. The most expensive war before the Civil War was the war with the Seminoles, Florida, Alabama, swamps. Why? Slaves were running away, hiding among the native population. Creeks, Choctaws, Chickasaws, Cherokees, Seminoles. The native populations were fighting to maintain their freedom and their independence to keep those slaves with them as free people. This country spent $40 million fighting to exterminate Native Americans in the eastern part of the United States. When they couldn't exterminate, they shipped the Cherokee, the 5 civilized tribes they call them, on the Trail of Tears in 1842 out to the west, Oklahoma, reservations. They confined the Seminoles, who are still at war technically with the United States, into the Everglades in Florida. It's the most expensive war this country fought before the Civil War. Not about freedom, but to extend slavery. Right? It's the next war before the Civil War, Mexican War. Remember the Alamo? Let's not remember the Alamo. They have yet to make a movie about the Alamo. They made another one trying to clean it up a little bit. Where's the movie that says that Jim Bridges a slaveholder? David Crockett's a slaveholder. Sam Houston is a slaveholder. Stephen A. Austin is a slaveholder. They are fighting to expand slavery into Mexico because Mexico had abolished slavery. Santa Anna may have been a dictator, but there was no slavery in Mexico, and slaves were running away from the South into Mexico to be free. Freedom-loving Texans carrying their slaves into Mexico said, you cannot bring these people here. We don't have slavery. What's the response to declare Texas independent? Not for freedom, but to expand slavery. Make that movie. Put Denzel in that one. As a slave who had run away and is fighting in the Mexican army at the Alamo. That's the movie. Black people in the Mexican army at the Alamo fighting slaveholders. Make that movie. See? The cost of racism is you don't know what happened in this country. You glorify slaveholders as heroes because you don't know they're slaveholders. You're not taught that. You walk around in complete ignorance of that. Right? You have political leadership in the 19th century that ignored slavery. Right? The people that said abolish slavery, we are taught are fanatics. William Lloyd Garrison, oh, fanatical abolitionist, oh, fanatic. John Brown, oh, he's crazy. John Brown, oh, he's crazy. Oh, no, crazy. No. What did Garrison believe? Slavery was wrong. should be abolished. Why does that make you crazy? Why is that a sign of lunacy? Why is Thomas Jefferson not crazy for owning slaves? And William Lloyd Garrison's crazy for wanting to abolish slavery. That's what you teach in your books. Look at the paragraph on William Lloyd Garrison in any textbook you got. See what they say about it. And John Brown. What did John Brown want to do? John Brown believed in direct action. He was a good American. Got a problem, solve it. How do you solve the problem of slavery? John Brown said, well, it's very simple. You kill all the slaveholders. That's the American way, right? That's why we have the largest military in the world. When we have a problem, kill it. Right? You don't like something, kill it. Right? That's why we got this massive military. Right? You got to drop bombs on it. John Brown was an American. He said, we have a problem, slavery, kill it. They said, oh, no, 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 he's crazy. Why is he crazy? Well, he started to do it. Went to Kansas and Nebraska, to stop the expansion of slavery by killing slaveholders. Guess who caught him? Robert E. Lee at Harper's Ferry in the Union Army. And they told John Brown they were going to hang him. John said, I understand. I lost. I didn't win. His last words were, he said, do you regret what you did? He said, the problem was we didn't kill enough people. He said, I made a mistake because I thought we could solve this problem by killing a few slaveholders. He said, we're going to have to purge this land with blood before we end slavery. Now, you would think that somebody listening to that would say, slavery is a problem, let us end it and solve this problem. Nobody did. What happens 2 years after John Brown is dead? Fort Sumter, the Civil War. There are more casualties, dead and wounded, in the Civil War than in all the American wars combined. All of them. World War I, World War II, Vietnam, Spanish-American War, and the numbers in Iraq. More in the U.S. Civil War to abolish slavery than in all the wars this country's fought combined. No. But if you had said to white Americans, give me 1 million lives to free the slaves, they said, no, I'm not doing that. But to ignore slavery cost 1 million lives. Right? To not have compensated emancipation, you had in the West Indies. Right? To ignore racism cost almost 1 million white people their lives. Not black people. They wouldn't even let us in the army. There were only 200,000 black people that had to fight their way into the army to fight. Right? They had to demand the right to fight. Then they wouldn't even pay them equal wages. So they said, don't pay us anything. The 54th and 55th turned back to pay. They said, we can't pay you what we pay white people because you're not good enough. And besides, you're black. They said, don't pay us anything. We'll fight for free. Right? For free. It cost 1 million white people their lives. And over 1 million white people their limbs and their arms. Over slavery. But if you had put that on the table, nobody would have bought it. But the failure to deal with slavery, that's the price white people paid. For looking the other way. For ignoring it, saying, well, it's not my problem. We'll deal with it next year sometime. Right? So you think maybe people would learn, right, after slavery is over. All black people say, well, let's forget about the past. Don't dwell on slavery. Can we have the minimum to live as Americans? We worked for over 250 years with no compensation. Can we have just 40 acres, small farm, and 1 mule to work it? No. No. Can't have it. Son American. You're free now. You're on your own. Well, what about back pay? No. No. You're not entitled to anything. You're free. You're on your own. And so black Americans tried to put their lives together as ex-slaves and made the most remarkable transitions in American democracy this country's seen. The first public schools in the South were put into place by Reconstruction governments dominated by ex-slaves. Free public education for everybody. You had no public schools in the South because to educate white Southerners would be the slaves might hear something and learn something, therefore nobody gets educated. Right? The price of keeping black people dumb is to keep white people just as dumb. And they're proud of it. At least they're not black. Right? That's why even today, when you think higher education, great schools, you don't think Mississippi, Alabama, Georgia. Right? Some of those places didn't get mandatory school attendance until the 1970s. 1970s, you didn't have to go to school. It wasn't the law that said you had to go to school in Mississippi to the 1970s. Right? White or black. You know. Black people set up the public state universities in the South during Reconstruction. University of South Carolina. First president was a black man, Richard T. Greener. University of Mississippi. University of Georgia. For everybody, not just for themselves, for everybody. White people looked at those, threw the black people out, said, this is barbarism. We can't have this, like, put them out. And then they kept the schools. They didn't say the schools are bad, they said you can't have them. They hadn't thought of it themselves. And then they threw black people out of political office. The Klan, armed struggle, military force drove black people back into desegregation, disenfranchisement, segregation. And then you had the turn of the century, you have Jim Crow. Where they said, we're not going to deal with race anymore. It's too much of a hassle, but you're here today. Right? We're going to let Southerners handle Southern problems. And if they think it's necessary to oppress the black population to keep things in order, that's okay. Right? How do you pay for that? Well, you know how you pay for that? When white immigrants come over in the 1880s in large numbers, 14 million from 1880 to 1920, right? What they learn how to be is white. They're not white in Europe. They're Italians, they're Germans, they're Poles, they're Irish, they're Jews. When they come to America, all of a sudden there's something called white. And they say, look, in America, regardless of how low you fall, there are black people up underneath you. So you know where you're better off when there's no black people around. Right? Or if they're around, you're stepping on them. That way you know you're not at the bottom. And white immigrants, by and large, bought this. And they established organizations that were segregated. Trade union movement, American Federation of Labor, right? The Brotherhood of Railway Trainmen, conductors, firemen, maintenance away, whites only. Plumbers unions, whites only. Mechanics, whites only. Firemen, whites only. Policemen, white only. You know. To this day, there are only three black people in the electrical unions in the state of Massachusetts. 1, 2, 3. A legacy of that. We're not even going to talk about police and fire departments. We know about those. They're in the papers all the time. White only. Right? What is this to cost to white people? You form an all-white union and go to negotiate a contract. I want $2 an hour. I got news for you. I'll pay the niggas $1. Uh-oh. Don't like it? Quit. I can get niggas in here for $1. Okay, I'll settle for the $1.50. It just costs you some money. Racism costs you money. I want unemployment compensation. Niggas don't have that. Okay, I'll pull that off the table too. To this day, the working class in this country is the most poorly organized in the world, and it took us to the 1930s to get the minimum of social gains that every European working class had in the 1880s. National health insurance, we don't have. Workers' compensation, unemployment compensation, Social Security had to come to the 1930s. Why? Because every time white people ask for it, they say, black people don't have it. You want them to have it? They say, oh, no, no, no. So they didn't have it. People hurt themselves. Right? White workers took jobs that were hazardous because they were white jobs. The best example is working in textile mills. You know, North Carolina, 1920s, textile mill, big looms, huge looms, whole room, big as this room, white job, right? No child labor laws. Who works in those plants? Young white kids. What is their job? To crawl up under the loom and take the knots out. What happens when you do that? You pull a knot out, the machine moves, the kid is crushed. Thousands of needles in their bodies and they die. That's a white job. Black people aren't allowed in those plants. Where are the young black kids? Going to school. Can't get a job in the factory, send them to school. Racism is costing white people. White Southerners are sending their kids to work, black people are sending their kids to school because they can't get in a racist factory. Who's hurting who? Who's benefiting from that? And then they finally unionize, they make a movie, of course, Norma Ray, white person. We know that's not true. They didn't unionize those mills until they brought black women in there in the 1930s. It's black women that said, we're not taking this. They said, no, no, we always take out the trash. No, no, this says work these machines, so nobody no trash. And by the way, my husband's in the yard, he's not making no money, so we're going to talk about that too. You know, white women organized the textile workers in North Carolina. Black women did. And the white women dragged along behind. Of course, they make the movie. They're not going to put no sister in that. Henry Berry's not going to play no union organizer. Right? So y'all think that Norma Ray organized all them people. No. Racism costs you because you don't know what's going on. Right? You're confused. Right? How does this affect policy in this country during the 20th century? Those same white politicians that got the 3/5 representation under Jim Crow, they got all of us discounted. If I'm Eastland or Bilbo, Strom Thurmond, and I want to run for office, what's the population of my county, or my state, or my congressional district? 60% black, 70% black. They can't vote. There's a literacy requirement, but that means illiterate white people can't vote. There's a poll tax, poor white people can't vote. What is my constituency? 5 to 10% of the people in my congressional district. Who's that? Me and my cousins. And you wonder how I got seniority in Congress. There's nobody can run against me. There's not an immediate member in my family. And so white Southern congressmen dominated the Congress of this country for the first 60 years of the 20th century. That's why you have no Social Security, no health insurance, no public education money, no high standards for anything. That's why. Right? And that's why when they put in Social Security, they explicitly exempted black people. The two occupations that black people had when they brought in Social Security, domestic labor and farm labor, were exempt from Social Security, right, to the 1970s. Right? You think we're the only people that work on farms? No, the majority of farm workers are white. You think we're the only domestic labor? The majority of domestic laborers are white. In order to hold black people down, you hold down large numbers of white people. They haven't figured it out yet. You know, you can shut down any program in this country by saying it's good for black people. What about welfare? Oh, black people, black people. Majority of people on welfare are white. White. No benefits for them. No, no, they just laying up somewhere having babies. White women don't get benefits because of that. Right? But to stop the program, you show a black face. That's why racism costs you. Show a black face, you stop the program. And they come tell you it's black people's fault. There's not enough money for education. Why can't poor white people get into school? Black people got all the positions. Affirmative action, black people got all the spots. Now we looked around, UMass has got 2% black people, right? There's about 5,000 white people every year that don't get in. All of them swear to God it's because black people got their spot. The reality is there's not enough money put into higher education, right? We need doctors in this country. Why are people fighting for slots in medical school? The solution to the problem is to expand the medical schools, not have you fight for slots. If you have people that want to be doctors and you need doctors, expand the medical schools. Don't have, I could have got into Harvard, well, a black person got in there, he wasn't qualified. First of all, that's not true. But the fact is that both of you need to be doctors, add on to the size of Harvard Medical School. That's the solution to the problem. But everybody is fighting over stuff at the bottom. Right? White people have yet to figure out that everybody in the world, black, don't have their spot. Right? Nobody's mad at George Bush. Anybody mad at the Rockefellers? Anybody mad at the Carnegies? They mad at people on welfare. Oh, I'd be really well off, except those people on welfare got my money. The numbers don't even add up. The amount of money that goes into welfare is paid for by the bottom 20% of the tax bracket. Rich people don't pay for welfare. You don't pay for it. Poor people pay for themselves. Right? Whites have yet to figure that out. I'll give you two last examples to show you how this distorts reality. People are very upset about the war in Iraq. You have a right to be upset. They showed these people they got dragged out of these things, burnt to death. Some people were hung. This is outrageous. This is barbaric. Black people said, are they kidding? Have you ever heard of lynching? No. There's a book called Without Sanctuary. Without Sanctuary. It is a collection from an exhibit of lynching postcards. There are at least 10 images in the book, more in the exhibit, of black bodies burnt. Right? There are images of black people hung from bridges, a woman and her son. These images include rings and circles of large numbers of white people dressed up for the event, getting their picture taken with the body, and taking pieces of the body, burnt body, home for souvenirs. A photographer, of course, took a picture to sell to those people that missed the event. Therefore, the postcards. Right? People bought the postcards who went to the lynchings and mailed them to their friends saying, oh, you missed our latest barbecue. Here's the nigger and his son that we burnt up. Right? This country has no moral authority whatsoever to chastise any country on the face of the earth for barbarism. None whatsoever. That's the cost of racism to you. Right? You can stand anywhere you want and talk about freedom and justice and liberty, and black Americans say, what about us? You got to sit down and shut up. That's the cost of racism to you. You know, that you're seeing worldwide as hypocrites. Now, if you deal with that and say we acknowledge our past and are working on that past, then people say at least we're ashamed of it and we're dealing with it. Right? But to not know it and to actively fight not to know it, right, is one of the crimes in higher education. You know, when we start black studies, you said, we want to talk about the history of black people. Oh, that's propaganda. You think Washington and the Delaware ain't propaganda? Or the cherry tree? I mean, come on. Or Lewis and Clark, come on. Or David Crockett and them, all that stuff. We're not talking about telling stories. We're talking about let's get this thing straightened out. You know. Let's get this thing straightened out. You know. It's 50 years since Brown. Americans claim they believe in equality and integrated education. They don't believe in either one. It's 50 years since Brown. Schools are neither integrated nor equal. White Americans, when they feel like it, can put somebody on the moon and send a spaceship to Mars. If they wanted to integrate the schools in this country, they could have done it. They didn't want to. My integrated school in Washington, D.C. lasted 3 years. You know, 1956, went into high school, 20% black. 1959, graduated, 80% black. If white people that wanted integration, all they had to do was stay still. Then we couldn't have been 80%. We'd have still been 20%. There wouldn't been no space. As fast as we came in one door, they went out the other. And took the money, because the school is not equal. If they had said, okay, we're leaving you the school, but we're leaving the money behind, then they could have gone. Then at least we would have had the equality side. They didn't want integration or equality. And that's as true today as it was 50 years ago. You know. Who's hurt in this state? And I'll give you two examples in this state to close up by this. That recent report, funding for education in the state. People think that's about minorities. You know, schools in Springfield get less money than schools in Newton. Schools in Lowell, you know, Holyoke get less money than schools outside of Boston. Inner city schools in Boston get less money. They say, oh, this is about black people. You ever look at the figures for Orange, Athol, Gardner? Ain't no black people there. Wichita, ain't no black people there. Poor white people are suffering because of this. But if you make it a race thing, you don't even see the problem. Poor white people. Where is the money going? I teach in the prisons in this state. For 30 years now, every prison I've taught in has doubled in size. Brand new, doubled in size. Every last one is doubled in size the past 30 years. It costs $40,000 a year to put somebody in a prison. $40,000 a year. That means for 4 years, $160,000. To go to UMass costs $10,000 a year. I talked in Old Colony, 3 months ago, Black History Month. I had an audience of 150 black and Latino men. They're getting paid $40,000 a year to sit there. Give me that money. I could have brought them out of there and put them in UMass for $10,000 a year. Right? That's your money. That's why this school doesn't have more. The money that could go to education in this state is going to prisons. The majority of the prisoners are black and Latino. Right? You are paying for that. Racism is costing you money. You can't get away from that. You can sit there and say, well, you got to lock them up. You're paying for it. Do you want the $40,000 to go to them, or do you want it in this school here? You know, don't double the size of Old Colony, double the size of Greenfield Community College. Right? If you can give them a $40,000 scholarship, why aren't you out here on free scholarships? You shouldn't pay any tuition at those prices. You know, one inmate will pay tuition for 4 people here for a year? One inmate. Right? But if you think that race is that important and that black people are that dangerous, or you fear them so much that you're willing to sacrifice your education to keep them incarcerated, you will stay dumb and they will stay incarcerated. And you will not solve the problem of racism. Right? And you can't say it's not your problem, it is your problem. You're paying for that. You're paying for that. That's the cost of racism. You know, racism is not free. No, it's not free. Yeah. Now I'll leave you with that one. I won't give you the last one, which I forgot. But I'll leave you. If I think of it again, I'll give it to you. That should be enough to get the point. You know. The point is that historically, the way race, I didn't even talk about the war. The war was the last one. I didn't talk about that. You know, that the military can suck up millions and millions and millions and millions and millions of dollars because the whole rest of the world is them. You know, that's how you pay for that. How you paying for that? That's your money. Talk about money down the drain. That is seriously money down. That is money down a rat hole. You know, if all you know about the rest of the world is that they hate us and therefore kill them, you won't have a penny for this school to be, you know, Westover Air Base will still fly them C-5. Every one of them planes costs 5 times this building. Every one of them. You know. Somebody can walk into Congress and get an aircraft carrier faster than you get a library. You're paying for that. You know. And if you buy into the notion, right, that the holding on to a vestige of white supremacy is that important that you're willing to pay for it, then you will live in a world that will have war, more war, and more war. You know. And the Civil War would look like a picnic. You know. The solution to this problem is to see in every human being on the planet yourself. You know, because racism is the failure to look in the face of any other human being and see yourself. You know, if you can look into the face of any other human being, regardless of what they look like, size, shape, color, gender, you know, and not see another human being, it's the only way you can kill another human being, you know, or see them suffer. But if you look at the face, you know, of a Venezuelan child, an Iraqi child, you know, a Bedouin man, you know, Moroccan woman, and say that's a human being, then you put down the gun. You say, let's talk. What is your problem? What resources do you have to offer me? What do I have to offer you? That's the world you want to live in. Right? But it begins with that stretch of imagination that says every human being on this planet, you know, is entitled to what you have. And if they're not entitled to everything that you have, they're entitled to the right to pursue their lives to the fullest. Right? And they're entitled to the same respect you want for yourself, the same dignity you want for yourself. And if in any part of your life you cannot look at any human being and see that, you better check yourself. Check yourself. You know. Whether it's the ethnic group next door, whether it's Catholic, non-Catholic, whether it's somebody in a wheelchair, whether it's somebody you don't like their hair, you don't like their clothes. You know. If you cannot see in the face of every human being on this planet, every human being, regardless of where they came from, what their history is, if you can't see yourself in them, you know, then this problem will continue. And the world will be a very dangerous place to live. You know. And until we can get to the point that I'm talking about, the cost of racism to white Americans is going to be high, it's going to stay high, and it might even go up. Right? Thank you.
Hello guys, welcome back to the channel. I hope you're great. I hope you've learned from the video that you've watched. And I prepared a presentation that I want to share with you in regards to this. Now, the psychological cost of racial superiority myths, the internalization of racial superiority myths fosters a deep psychological contradictions. White individuals raised under the notion of automatic superiority may experience cognitive dissonance when confronted with failure or hardship. If the system tells you that whiteness equals merits and success, you remain unemployed, addicted, or impoverished, the contradiction can lead to shame, anxiety, and depression, or even rage. This is exacerbated when white people see people of color in visible position of power or success, which under the white supremacist worldview is perceived not as progress but as a threat. Instead of engaging in structural explanation for inequality, the psychological architecture of racism promotes a scapegoating and deflection, further isolating white individuals from solutions rooted in justice and equity. Now, this is what happens. You've probably heard or talked about something to deal with white rage, right? So when we talk about the white rage, this is what happens. Sometimes due to cognitive dissonance, and this is a psychological cost to white supremacy. Now, you've grown as a white person knowing that you are automatically superior. The fact that you were born, and this is being aided by where you come from, the school that you learn, and how people around you do things or how people around you perceive things. Now, that being said, it means that when you are growing, probably your parents will treat you in a way, in a space where there are black people or other people of color. Your parents will treat you in a way that make you feel special. And this is how they also perpetuate racism, right? And now when you're growing up, you start seeing black people occupying prominent spaces. And when black folks occupy prominent spaces, and due to the cognitive dissonance that you have, you tend not to believe that a black person can do that, right? Now, when you believe that a black person can do that, you remain conflicted. And this is where the cognitive dissonance comes, because you believe that everything good belongs to you and everything which is not good belongs to other people, right? So a couple of psychological things that affect black folks is the cognitive dissonance Strip talked about, because all along they grow in an environment understanding that they are greater, they are automatically greater. The fact that you're a white person, it gives you a priority, it gives you leverage against other black folks. But when you realize that we have also black people are occupying all these spaces, it explains why we have things like the white rage and all those things that are happening. I'm also going to be discussing about divided labor markets and economic exploitation. One of the foundational economic critiques made by scholars like Theodore Allen and W.E. Du Bois, and echoed by Bracy, is that racism has historically segmented the labor market in a way that lower wages prevent workers' unity, pitting white and black laborers against each other. This has allowed capitalists to suppress unionization efforts, stagnate wages, and maintain exploitative working conditions. For instance, by hiring black workers as strike breakers or relegating them to lower tied jobs, employers manipulate white workers into seeing their black counterparts as threats rather than allies. As a result, the labor movement in America has suffered a chronic fragmentation, and white workers have forfeited collective bargaining power for the illusion of racial dominance. The fact that they see themselves put with black folks, this makes them, kind of angry. And capitalism has caused this, chronic fragmentation. America is so fragmented. We have different racial lines, we have different social structure, and all these people are put in, different ways, and they want to operate the way they want, right? And so a person coming from an household believing that they are greater than black folks will not want to do a job, especially when they see black people in those places, because psychologically they see or they believe that that's not the job that they should be doing. They feel like it's lower, right? The bar is so low for them to do that job. I'm also going to be talking about educational deprivation through segregation and miseducation. The education system shaped by white supremacist logic has also hurt white students. Curricula that distort or omit the histories and contribution of people of color not only deny students with the truth, but they also impoverish their understanding of the world. By perpetuating myths of white moral, culture, and intellectual superiority, schools produce generations of students unequipped to engage in a multicultural society or a globalized economy. Furthermore, when public school systems prioritize racial segregation or the maintenance of white enclaves over funding equality and educational excellence, it often leads to underinvestment in rural and poor white communities as well. Many white students in these areas attend underfunded schools with limited access to modern resources, college prep programs, and critical thinking instructions, leaving them educationally disfranchised by the very system supposedly built for their benefit. So that's what happened. And for the longest time, the black achievements have always been taken. This has been deliberately done by the people who had power to rewrite their own history, write what they think is right in front of everyone. And so, while they lied about black history, while they lied about prominent black people, they also lie to white students, right? And so people are working with the lie that black people didn't do anything great, but that's the lie. Instead of giving them a true history of what happened, all they were given was a lie. And so as a result, there was deprivation of truth. White students, they were deprived the truth, and also black students also, they were deprived the truth. I'm also going to be talking about the decline of social trust and civil engagement. Racism undermines social cohesion, erodes public trust, and weakens democracy. When white individuals are socialized to view their fellow citizens of color as threats, it distorts their ability to engage collectively, right? Action for the public good. This civic fragmentation makes it difficult to sustain broad coalitions necessary to push for policies like universal healthcare, living wages, or environmental protection. As Dr. Bracy and others have pointed out, societies that invest in racial division ultimately find themselves unable to respond to collective cries as people are consumed with fear, blame, or suspicion to act in unison. The result is fragmented, reactive polity, vulnerable to demagoguery, conspiracy theories, and authoritarianism. These are trends that we've seen increasing among the economically distressed white populations. This is what happens most of the times, right? Because of the mistrust, and this affects the civic engagement. Just look at recently what happened in the United States before the election, and when black folks are trying to warn white people about whoever they'll choose, but they still went out and choose. Why did they listen to black folks in as much as they knew that this was wrong? It is because of the social trust that is always there. Like black people cannot tell me anything. They are below the strata. I cannot hear any black person say something. I'm also going to be talking about opioid crisis and healthcare disparities. In recent years, the opioid epidemic has ravaged many white working class communities, particularly in rural and post industrial regions. This public health crisis reflects structural neglect, economic disinvestment, and a fraying of social support system. However, the early racialized response to the crack epidemic, where black communities were criminalized rather than aided, meant that little public infrastructure was built to handle addiction compassionately or comprehensively. When the opioid crisis hits white communities, there is no ready policy framework for support. Furthermore, the racist stigmatization of drug use as black issue delayed the development of human treatment programs, ultimately costing thousands of white lives. This is a tragic example of how white supremacy selectively concerns becomes a boomerang, where what's denied to others eventually isn't there when you need it either. So these are presented generic stories. That was the presentation that I had in regards to what Dr. John H. Bracey talked about. I hope to see you in my next video, but until then, peace, love, and harmony, and stay blessed, everyone from wherever you're watching us from. Bye, and stay blessed. So